relax, and enjoy some Mary Poppins. There's not too many illustrations in this book, but I just wanted to show you the one on the first page because I really like it. I really like this one. Mary Poppins, the book was written by P.L. shaped like a telescope. "Ha," said Mr. Banks, drawing it in his head very quickly. "Admiral's telescope says east wind. I thought as much. There's frost in my bones. I shall wear 2 overcoats." And he kissed his wife absent-mindedly on the one side of her nose and waved to the children, and then went away to the city. Now, the city was a place where Mr. Banks went every day except Sundays, of course, and bank holidays. And while he was there, he sat on a large chair in front of a large desk and made money. All day long he worked, cutting out pennies and shillings and half-crowns and 3-penny bits. And he brought them home with him in his little black bag. Sometimes he would give some to Jane and Michael for their money boxes, and when he couldn't spare any, he would say, "The bank is broken," and they would know he hadn't made much money that day. Well, Mr. Banks went off with his black bag, and Mrs. Banks went into the drawing room and sat there all day long, writing letters to the papers and begging them to send some nannies to her at once. As she was waiting, the upstairs and in the nursery, Jane and Michael watched at the window and wondered who would come. They were glad Katie Nana had gone, for they never liked her. She was old and fat and smelled of barley water. Anything they thought would be better than Katie Nana, if not much better. When afternoon began to die away, behind the park, Mrs. Brill and Ellen came to give them their supper and to bathe the twins. And after supper, Jane and Michael sat at the window watching Mr. Banks to come home and listening to the sound of the east wind blowing through the naked branches of the cherry trees in the lane. The trees themselves, turning and bending in the half-light, looked as though they had gone mad and were dancing their roots out of the ground. "There he is," said Michael, pointing suddenly to a shape that banged heavily against the gate. Jane peered through the gathering darkness. "That's not Daddy," she said. "That's somebody else." Then the shape tossed and bent under the wind, lifted the latch of the gate, and they could see that it belonged to a woman who was holding her hat on with one hand and carrying a bag in the other. As they watched, Jane and Michael saw a curious thing happen. As soon as the shape was inside the gate, the wind seemed to catch her into the air and fling her at the house. It was as though it had flung her first at the gate, waited for her to open it, and then lifted and thrown her, bag and all, at the front door. The waiting children heard a terrific bang, 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 and she landed. The whole house shook. "How funny. I've never seen that happen before," said Michael. "Let's go and see who it is," said Jane. Taking Michael's arm, she drew him away from the window, through the nursery and out onto the landing. From there, they always had a good view of anything that happened in the front hall. Presently, they saw their mother coming out of the drawing room said Mrs.